Thanks, Beverly. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides. It's not a problem, but I'm actually from the Institute of Education, UCL Institute of Education, not Birkbeck, just so you know. I think you have had Birkbeck presenters before, so that may be where it came from, but just so you know exactly where I'm from. Now let me go through and do this. And hopefully sometimes it just takes a long time to upload. So hopefully that won't be the case. So what I'm going to do, I'll do a brief recap from last week's session. I understand that not everybody, or not all of you, will have been at last week's session. So I just thought I would just do a brief recap on that. And before we go into talking about long-term memory, so just a minute. Can everybody see that okay? Just put a yes or say yes.
It's put, yep, yes, we can see it. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so just a brief recap of what we're going to talk about. Last week we talked about Last week we talked about working memory. So this is a process where the frontal lobes, the front part of the brain, is implicated, but it is very important in learning because it's our ability to focus our attention on what is important and filter out information that is not important. And so just to recap the types of things that this allows us to do. Last week I went through some exercises where you could demonstrate for yourself that working memory, and specifically abilities such as filtering out information that isn't relevant to the task at hand, or switching your attention between rules or sets of information, or holding information in mind while you're doing another task. All of that is limited and it is effortful. And it's the type of thing that we use in novel situations. So working memory, what that allows us to do is to, as I said, inhibit irrelevant information, think flexibly. It allows us to plan. So plan a task, prioritize components of that task, solve problems. So, you know, for example, if you were driving to work and you found out that the road that you normally take something's happened, you can't take that route, then you would use what we call executive abilities, like working memory, to actually work out another route to work. And that's when you use things like working memory, because you need to hold information in mind and think flexibly about what the options are, and then plan and prioritize your actions. It's also important in remembering to remember, so remembering to post that letter on the way home. And I know that lots of us will have that's called prospective memory, and lots of us will have examples of prospective memory failure. It also allows you to fluently recall information on demand, so rapidly being able to access information from long-term memory to be applied to the task at hand, and obviously also store information temporarily. So working memory, as you can probably gather, is very important in learning. We talked about this last week. It's important in demanding tasks in novel situations, which of course are things that happen in the classroom or any learning situation, anywhere where you learn new information. If you're following instructions, and if you're doing things like reading and mathematics, those both require you to hold information in mind while you're doing something else. We also briefly spoke about how different types of developmental disorders, those populations, have different profiles of working memory, so have deficits in different components or different abilities related to working memory, which I'm not going to go through again now because we did last week, but there's the slide there, and as this is recorded, you can refer back to that. So last week we talked about the learning process, where we actually focus our attention on something so that we can process that information and apply it to the task at hand. But of course, in learning, we also want to create long-term memories for the new information. And so whereas last week we talked about inhibiting irrelevant information, switching, thinking flexibly, processing and storing information, We're going to primarily look at context, elaboration and recall in long-term memory today. But again, I'm just going to briefly go through the memory formation process. It's not going to be very long, but just because this is the type of thing that we will refer back to. We will refer back to later. So when something happens, like me talking now, something that you decide that you want to focus your attention on or need to focus your attention on, neurons start to fire. And a set of neurons, so two neurons will start to fire and then some other neurons fire. And when neurons fire together, and you might be familiar with Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together wire together. And even though there's a lot has happened since Hebb, that means that we know a lot more about the learning process, that still kind of holds true. When neurons fire together, they create connections. And then what happens is we recruit, the frontal lobes recruit resources, recruit cognitive resources so that we can focus our attention, and this increases that firing of neurons. And I'm not going to get, I've already gone over the sort of the working memory side, but now we want to look at what happens then when we actually create memories, create long-term memory of information so that we can readily recall it when we need it. So I did talk about this briefly last week, but I will recap here. So what happens when we actually form a memory? The components of the event, so me now, but you can see me, you can see the slides, you can hear me. You're also aware of your environment, and you'll all be in different environments because this is an online session. What happens is those individual components of the event, of the whole event, are analysed. Okay, so our brains analyse that information, and like I said, acoustic, visual, all sorts of things. And those components are associated with previously recorded events. So for example, you've seen a computer before, you've seen a person before, you've heard these words before, maybe not in this order, but you've heard these words. We use existing information to make sense of the new event that is occurring. So that is an automatic process where we associate new information with previously recorded events. So that information, those different components of the event, the context, which we will talk about, they are all analysed individually. They're associated with existing information that we have in long-term memory. They are then combined. So this is what happens in the hippocampus. The hippocampus, as you may already know, is that if you went in from your ears right to the middle of the brain, roughly there you would find the hippocampus. And that's very, very important in the creation of long-term memories. And we know this because we have, unfortunately, traumatic brain injury patients where there's been a stroke or some disease like encephalitis or something, where the hippocampus has been severely damaged and no longer works. And those people can no longer form new long-term memories. Now, to be specific here, and I didn't want to turn this into a whole memory lecture, but we are talking very much about declarative memories, so memories that you can actively recall. So these could be facts and events, like what's the capital of France, when was the Battle of Hastings, that sort of thing, when did the First World War start, when did the Second World War end. All those things are facts that you actively recall. If I said to you, what did you do last year for your birthday? What did you do at the weekend? What did you have for breakfast this morning? Those, again, are all declarative memories. You actively recall them. You think about them. Oh, yeah, that's what I did this morning. That's what I had for breakfast this morning. That's very different from me saying to you, how do you ride a bike? Or if any of you are musical, you know, like how do you play the piano? You don't actively recall the different components of that ability. It's something that we call implicit memory or non-declarative memory. So it's procedural in nature. It's like any of you who driving a car, you don't think, oh, okay, so I need to put my foot down on the clutch and then I need to change gear and then I have to release my foot. It's all done automatically. Those are procedural, implicit memories that we don't actively recall. We're not talking about those. I touch on them slightly, but we're not really talking about those today. What we're talking about is this thing that we call declarative or explicit memory. So, sorry, back to the poor people who've had their hippocampus damaged. They can no longer form new declarative memories. So somebody, I don't know if any of you know the case of Henry Molaison or Clive Wearing. These are very famous case studies. And they cannot remember, what happened 5 minutes ago or 2 minutes ago, because all they have is short-term memory, which is really attention, which is the frontal lobes. So focusing attention on some information and holding it in mind for a short period of time. What they don't have, excuse me, is this ability that the hippocampus provides, which is taking components of an event, analysing it all, associating it with existing knowledge, combining it, and then, I finally get to this slide that is up, sending that information out to the neocortex, so that foldy top bit of your brain. That's the newest part of our brain in evolutionary terms. And that information is sent out to the neocortex, where that information is retained. Now, this isn't something that you can see. There isn't a little what I had for breakfast, what I did for my birthday. It's neural networks that fire when that information is recalled. And this is very important. And again, I want to be aware that a lot of you are educationalists and will have learnt about, how we form memories. So I am aware of that. But just for the record, when we recall an event, we do not just play it back like a recording. What we do is we reactivate the neural networks that were firing, that occurred when that event was first learnt, when we first experienced it. And that becomes important later on when I talk about how we form long-term memories. So this information goes out in the form of neural networks, so connections between neurons, brain cells, where they are retained and also retrieved, as I just explained. And what happens is when you retrieve that information, you further consolidate it. So basically that means you make it more robust. You make that memory more robust. So I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to do some exercises with you to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So we will talk about learning and memory. We will talk about long-term memory. I'm going to briefly talk about levels of processing and repetition, but then we're going to talk in a bit more detail about context, elaboration, and retrieval. So levels of processing, this is quite an old study, but it still holds true. It's why a lot of the debate in the literature is why this is the case, rather than whether this is the case. So you could, it's a bit more of a spectrum, but you could say that there are 3 levels of processing: shallow processing, medium processing, and deep processing. So if I gave you a list of words and some of those words are in uppercase and some of those words are in lowercase, and I just said to you, look at this word and tell me whether it's in uppercase or lowercase, that is what we would call shallow level of processing. And I'll explain why in a minute. Then if I said to you, I'm going to show you some words, and what I want you to, it's paired with another word, and I want you to tell me whether those 2 words rhyme. So in this example again, house, if I was I'm at my mum's house at the moment, and she's just come back, and now my dogs are barking. So I will try and mute when they start barking, going berserk, but you might hear them in the background. So if I said it's paired with another word, and I want you to just say whether it rhymes with that word. So this we would call like a medium level of processing. But if I said, okay, here are some words, and each word has a sentence with it, I want you to tell me whether the word fits in that sentence and makes sense. So for example, here, house, the house has 4 windows, that makes sense. If the word was elephant, and it said the elephant has 4 windows, you can know that doesn't make sense, of course. So these are what we call levels of processing. Now, in the first level, it's shallow because you're not actually processing the meaning of the word at all. So you're not, you're just looking at the letters and seeing whether they're in upper, lower case. So in this you go, yeah, uppercase. If I showed you shallow is in lowercase, etc., etc. So because you're not processing the meaning of those words, you're not actually relating the meaning of that word or that word in its entirety to any existing information you have. Okay, so you're not creating context for that word. You're not elaborating on it in any way. If you looked at house and mouse, now you have to process the word a little bit more because you actually have to say the word in its entirety to work out how it sounds to see whether it rhymes with mouse. So you're processing the word a little bit more deeply because you actually have to articulate it, but you're not really thinking much about what that word means. But if I gave you the word house and said, does it make sense in this sentence, you would have to actually process what the word house means. Okay, it's a building and buildings have windows, so the house has 4 windows makes sense. Yeah, okay. Or if it was the elephant has 4 windows, you go, well, elephants don't have windows. I know what an elephant is. No, it doesn't have 4 windows. So you would actually have to say that word to yourself, know what that word means, and then, of course, that activates all sorts of other associations in your existing knowledge. So that's what level of processing is. And when you do experiments like this and you put people into different conditions and you give them some, the shallow, medium or deep levels of processing and you ask them to remember a bunch of words, there will be a significant difference in how many they can remember in the shallow condition compared to the medium condition, and then in the deep condition. In the deep condition, they're always going to be able to remember more words. And that's because the information has been processed more deeply. So all this will become relevant because we're going to have a discussion at the end, and then any of you who do actually work in an education setting might want to go away and try some activities to aid learning in your students, and then we're going to come back in a couple of weeks and discuss that. Right, so next, repetition. So repetition is something else that enhances learning and the formation of long-term memories. And the reason is what I was talking about before. It elicits interactions between neurons. So if I said to you, I'm just trying to think, trying to think of something that is novel and I can't because I'm so tired. But if I said to you, this is my brother's water, this is my mother's phone, and this is my husband's iPad, right? And if I did that for a number of things and then asked you again, you probably wouldn't remember exactly, what this was associated with and what this was associated with, etc. if I gave you a number of pairings. But if I did that over and over again, every time I did it, the interactions between neurons for that information would be activated again. And every time they're activated, as I said earlier, this creates stronger connections and makes that information easier to recall. Now, this is quite an interesting phenomenon, and it's linked to, if anybody knows about classical conditioning, Pavlov's dogs, the drooling dogs when the man with the white coat came in the room. So that's a classical conditioning. It's associative learning. This is kind of linked to that. What's interesting about it is when you have patients with amnesia, like the case studies that I talked about earlier, so they cannot form new long-term memories. They could eat their breakfast and then like 2 minutes later have no idea what they had for breakfast, given, if you took everything away. You could introduce yourself to them, walk out the room, come back into the room a minute later, and they would swear they'd never met you before. But the thing about repetition is people with amnesia can form new long-term memories when an event is repeated and repeated, but they can't remember the event having occurred. So I'll give you an example. This is a colleague of mine who's a neuropsychologist who worked with a patient who had encephalitis, so viral encephalitis, which destroys synapses in the brain. And she'd lost the ability to form new long-term memories. But she had to take medication because the disease that she'd had caused other problems with mild epilepsy and stuff. So she had to remember to take medication regularly, which you can imagine is problematic because she couldn't form new long-term memories. She couldn't remember that that's what she had to do. So what they did was, I mean, you do it on an iPhone now, but when this was, I think it was like an electronic device, like a Palm Pilot or something like that. And so what they did was they would pair an alarm on the Palm Pilot, on this device, with her taking her medication. So it would beep and they'd say, you have to take your medication, and she'd take it. And then it would beep again, no idea what it's for, you have to take your medication, and she would take it. And they did this, I can't remember if it was weeks or months, I think it was just something like 3 weeks. It wasn't long anyway. And then every time it beeped, she would open her bag, take out her medication, and take her medication for that day. But here's the interesting thing. And I've got a video of this and I couldn't find it to show you, which was annoying. But anyway, the device would beep. And I have a video of my colleague Ashok there, and he said, do you know what that means? No, I don't know what it means. As she would open her bag and take her medication. She had no memory of learning that connection. When it beeped, in the video, I think he says to her, do you know what this is? No, I've never seen it before. Because it was introduced to her life after she'd had the traumatic brain injury from the encephalitis. But when it beeped, she knew what to do, even though she couldn't remember learning it. So this is what's very interesting about repetition and this associative learning when you have, when you repeat a pairing of information, and in this case, a beep and a taking of a tablet. In learning, it's commonly used when you learn your times table in multiplication tables. So, we have kids. I don't know whether you still do it anymore, actually, because I very rarely am in classrooms these days where, they sit there and go 2 times 2 is 4, da, 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 da. Okay, somebody's shaking their head, so I don't think you do it. But when we were kids, that was the way we were taught. I was terrible at school and I never learnt mine, so I still have to do rapid mental maths. But not for 2 times 2, but for 7 times 9 or something. But it's commonly used in the classroom for that. So, and this, it is quite good because what it does in using this example of multiplication tables is it creates maths facts. So then when children come to do more complex calculations, it lowers cognitive load because they don't, like I have to, quickly work out what's 7 times 9. They just know it. So it reduces, it's just automatically recalled, and it reduces the cognitive load for the overall sum or the overall procedure task that they're going through. So that is repetition. It's very good. It's not the best. We're going to get to that. So here we go. We're going to talk about context, elaboration, and retrieval. I'm going to focus mainly on context and elaboration for the tasks, and retrieval we'll just talk about, because if we did retrieval, it would be boring for you. Boring to do the tasks, rather. I'll get to that, though. So here we go. I'm going to, don't write things down. Just see if you can remember this list of words, all right? I'll read them out just in case anybody has visual impairment, right? Smell, boot, toe, walk, soccer, shoe, arm, ankle, yard, mouth, hand, sock, sandals. Oh, yes, right. Now, I'm going to show you another list of words, and I want you to just say to yourself, was this word in that list that I was just shown, okay? Toe, flag, ankle, kick, inch, foot, boot, yard. Okay. Now, if anybody said yes to these words that are in yellow, kick, flag, foot, and inch, you were wrong. So did anybody think, I don't know whether you can remember, but did anybody think those words were in the list? So I'm just trying to remember what whether I've got. All right, no, that's it. Okay, so they were not in the list. This was the list. Okay, lots of people say no. Oh, you're so clever. But somebody did nod. If I did this to you a few times, you would find that you remember words that weren't there. And this is, if you think back to what I was saying earlier about when we learn new information, we associate it with existing knowledge. And so these words all related to sort of feet and shoes and boots, and there's the word soccer in there, so there's a little bit maybe about a football game, little things that would activate some kind of idea of people playing a sport or something to do with footwear. There's a number of things you could associate it with. Everybody has different experiences in life, so you associate it with different things. But what happens is you get some information, like this is a meaningless list, but if you can imagine something a bit more complicated, it activates existing knowledge and attaches that memory to knowledge that you already have. So when you're shown another list of words, and it has something in there like flag, foot, kick, inch, I would think people probably didn't falsely recall that because it's not really related to feet or running or a sport or something like that. You may have, but what happens is when you're presented this information again, you think foot, oh yeah, because that whole category of toe, boots, shoe, sock, sandal is activated. So you think, oh well, yeah, that was in there. Same flag maybe because of the soccer thing, and kick also because of the soccer thing and the feet. So, and I see a couple of people have said foot. Yeah, that would be a likely one to falsely recall. And this is a demonstration of how we form memories. We attach it. We don't just learn everything discretely, separate from other information. We learn it in a context. Let's try something else. So, again, no pens. Try and remember these words. Let me just skip ahead a bit with my... Okay, here we go. So, lion, dog, donkey, shark, eagle, butterfly, rabbit, elephant, cat. Right, so just maybe you can jot it down or have a think, or just let me know how many of those you think you would remember. It's like half, quarter, couple of them. You don't have to respond. This is for your own experience of memory formation. 7-ish. How many were on the list? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. Here's what was really interesting with young children. They always completely overestimate their ability to remember things. So if you say to them, as a researcher, I work with primary school children a lot, and especially like year threes. If you say to them, do you ever forget things, or do you think you've got a good memory? Yes. Do you forget things? No, I never forget things. I remember everything. And you could say to them, okay, I'm going to tell you 10 words. Do you think you'll be able to remember them all? Yep, absolutely, no problem at all. And then you start playing them, and you ask them to stop the audio when they think they won't remember any more words, and they normally stop about 3 or 4 or 5 words in when they realise, oh, actually, I can't remember all this information. But that's just an aside. That's about meta memory, which is a whole other area, your knowledge about your own memory. Okay, so we did that list and somebody is very competent in remembering 7-ish. I'm not going to test you, don't worry about that. I'm just demonstrating something. So now I'm going to read something out, but I'll put it on the screen as well, just in case anybody has a hearing impairment. Excuse me about the coughing. I'll just have a sip of water because I have to do a monologue. Right, here we go. Imagine a house, and when you walk into the living room, there is a lion lying on the couch, reading a book. There's a fireplace in the room where the dog is making cocktails. He's even wearing a waiter's jacket and a little bow tie. So now you go to the kitchen, and sitting at the table is a donkey who's playing poker. And at the head of the table sits a shark, a card shark, ha ha ha, little joke, all dressed up in his shirt and jacket, leaning back on his chair. On the stove is an eagle with his wings spread out wide. The eagle is overlooking the table, watching the card game. The kitchen's pretty crowded, so you walk into the dining room. And as you enter the dining room, there's a single butterfly perched on the chandelier. It's beautiful with bright blue wings. Below the chandelier is a big dining room table full of rabbits, and they're hopping all over the dining room table. And there are so many rabbits that they keep falling off the table. The last room on this floor is the bathroom. As you go in, you see a huge elephant sitting on the toilet. On the windowsill is a black cat stretched out in the sunshine. Like most cats, he's looking for the least crowded place in the house. He would dearly love to jump out of the window, but it's closed. So now, if I asked you, can you write down the list of all the animals that were in that story, which is the same as the original list I gave you when I just read out the list? Do you think that you would be likely to remember more than before, than when it was just a list, or about the same or less? You can put it in the chat, or you can just answer, yeah, more. So you can kind of picture it, can't you? You're walking through the house and there's all these things, like that was funny, the card shark. I mean, I know it wasn't a brilliant joke, but and the rabbits falling off the table and how beautiful the butterfly was and the funny image of an elephant sitting on the toilet. So you've got all these other things that you can connect that information to. I'm so sorry about this, got this tickle. Right. So now I'm not going to do the whole story again, but let's have a look at this. So here we've got a lion on the couch reading. We've got a dog here making the cocktails with his little jacket and his bow tie. And in the kitchen, you've got a donkey playing cards. There he is. And at the head of the table, you've got this card shark. So if this was, I won't read the whole story again, but if I read the whole story to you again, and with each thing I had an image, what do you think now that you would remember even more than before? I mean, you don't have to say yes, but I'm figuring yes, you would. Yes. Okay, and we're going to talk about why in a minute, even though it might seem quite intuitive. But yeah, if I'd read that whole story with those images coming up on screen, I'd say you would remember all of the animals, no problem. You'd be very confident about it and you'd be right. Okay, so what we've talked about there is context and elaboration. So when we looked at these words, where you had false recall, some of you recalled foot incorrectly. If I could do that again with things like words like sugar and butter and treacle and honey and chocolate and then show you another list and sneak in some other words like cake, then you would probably falsely recall cake, because this is context and this is how our memories work. This is how we've evolved. We don't learn everything fresh each time. We activate existing knowledge, which new information hooks onto a neural network, which makes that memory more robust. And you can imagine evolutionary, there's lots of reasons why we should remember things. Okay, and we'll get to that shortly. When we did this, and the story as well, that's elaboration. So you look at some individual things like dog, cat, whatever it was, and it's difficult to remember. But when you elaborate, you create more information around that, more memories around that information. So you create more roots into that memory when you want to recall it. Okay, because lots of other things activate when you try and recall that information. You say, oh, do you remember, like quite often when you're either explaining to somebody what happened, something that they can't remember, or you're actually recalling yourself. So it won't be, you might be trying to remember a party or whatever, but you might say something like, oh yeah, I remember because that was the night we missed the bus and we had to get a taxi, and then there was that taxi driver who was really weird, and yes, I remember. Don't you remember because when you got out of the cab you dropped your phone, so there's all these memories attached to that event, and that makes it so much easier to recall. Now who here leaves the house in the morning or whenever, and then as you're walking down the street thinks, oh, did I lock the front door? Did I lock it? I do that all the time. So here is something that you can do. If you lock the front door and then do something weird, okay? Like jump up and down or go like this or knock on the door 3 times or whatever. If you do that when you're walking down the street and you go, did I lock the door? You go, oh yeah, I remember because then I did these weird things. So you're creating more associations with that event, and that creates more roots into the memory. Okay, so all of this I'm hoping is becoming obvious to you, if any of you are educators, that you can do this with children and help them remember important information. We'll get to how that does work and doesn't work in a minute. It used to be the iron, yeah. Now I say out loud, iron off. And yeah, you see, so you've created an oral memory to attach to that event so that it's easier to recall. Now, somebody has the hand up. And Mr. Harrison, did you want to ask a question?
Yes. Sometimes we do activities or events while we're thinking of other things, and therefore that makes it even more difficult for us to remember whether we did those events. So while we locked the door, we might have been thinking what we needed to do when we got to work. And then when it comes to thinking, oh, did I lock the door? You can't remember because you did it automatically without any thinking involved in it.
Exactly. So when we leave the house and lock the door, it's procedural behavior. It's procedural memory. We know how to lock the door. We don't go, oh, I've shut the door now. How do I lock it? Oh yeah, I have to get the key and I have to put it in here and I have to turn it. This is what I was saying earlier about implicit and explicit memory. That's an implicit memory. We just do it automatically. We have to create an explicit memory to attach to it to actually remind ourselves that it happened. Now, that's not something that you'd necessarily do in the classroom. That's just my way of explaining this. Because you're right. I mean, I do it. I'm locking the door. I've got my bag on the shoulder. I've normally got my phone in my mouth because I haven't got a free hand. And I'm thinking, oh, what time was the train again? And then I walk off and I think, did I lock the door? Because you didn't even think about it. So you're absolutely right. That's what happens. So I'm going to briefly talk about recall, and I'm just going to talk about it very briefly. I'm not going to do an exercise because it's difficult to do an exercise without it just being boring. I would just give you some information and ask you to remember it. This is very, very effective. And unfortunately for children, testing is an extremely effective technique for getting them to create very robust long-term memories of information. But that doesn't mean it has to be stressful. Okay, so low stakes testing is a very effective technique, and a lot of you already be aware of this. So it's similar to repetition, because what you can do is you can do have a series of questions. What was the date of this event? What are the chemical components of something else? What's the French word for blah? I'm trying to think of a number of different topics that you might actually have to ask children or students in general to retain information in long-term memory and make that very, very robust so it's easy to recall. But if you do low stakes testing or something like errorless learning, which is where, do you know the answer to this? No, I don't. Here you go, look it up. I do this with my students at university all the time. I will one week teach a lecture, and the next week I will give them a quiz, but I say to them, first of all, I want you to try and remember the information. If you can't, discuss it with your peers. If you can't, then look it up, look at the lecture notes, Google it. I don't mind, as long as you recall the information and create an answer to this question. So with children, you can do, and this is why I've got the tick and the cross. You don't want to put stress on children when you're testing them. But if you test them on information and then they don't get it right, that's no problem. This is the answer, or let's look up the answer together. Test them again and again and again. This is the single best way, even though the other things do work in the learning process, this is the single best way to create robust long-term memories. But you can make it fun. But yes, it is. It's similar to repetition in the way that I just described, but it's not exactly that, because what you're doing is you're actually, every time information is recalled, it's recalled within the context in which it is being taught, but it's recalled in that context at that moment. And every time that happens, we attach that information to the context we're in, which attaches again to existing information that we have in our memory and creates more and more connections to that piece of information, which makes it easier to recall, creates more pathways into that memory. If that makes sense. But yeah, I didn't really want to do it. I would just have to test you on the same thing over and over again to do this, and it'd be a bit boring. So somebody has said, I've read that forgetting information is helpful before you recall it in terms of consolidation. Well, it is true in terms of, the more effortful the recall of information is, the more robust that memory becomes. So if you remember something, quite easily, you're not actually, so say I taught you something at the beginning of something new at the beginning of this talk, and then asked you at the end, and you remembered it quite easily for some reason. And then next week, you probably wouldn't remember it. If it was something obscure, it's more likely that you will have forgotten it. But if I asked you what it was and you forgot, and then you had to look it up, or you talked to somebody else about it, and then you said, I don't quite understand that, and they explained it to you, and then a number of events occurred, you are much more likely to remember that information later on than if you just easily recalled it. So in a way, it's true, because effortful recall is very effective. But, okay, cool. Right, so on to, what was I going to talk about now? What's the time? I feel like I've just been rabbiting. Oh my God, these sessions go so quickly. So we've looked at context, elaboration and recall. So why does this work? Well, I've really talked about this. When you recall information, it reactivates the neural network for where that memory is stored. When I say where it's stored, it's not little components. It really is just a number of connections. So every time you do that, remember at the beginning when I talked about memory formation and that information being analysed separately and going through the hippocampus and going out to the neocortex? That happens every time you recall information, okay? And it strengthens the associations and it creates more connections because you're in a slightly different or maybe very different context. I don't want to go on about that too much because I've realised what the time is. So context, how does context work? So new information, again, I've really explained it, is associated with established knowledge. Now, the thing about context is the more personal the information that you use to apply context, the better. So if I remember when I was learning French and I had to remember the verbs that are conjugated with the verb être, and they're all like doing words. And so I had this thing, and I even remember it now, it was avier, where I would remember each of the different verbs. So that was like a mnemonic where it was just the first letter of each verb to remember which of the verbs were conjugated with être when you were doing past participle. I'm going on a bit and now about French. But if you use mnemonics and rhymes, I don't know whether I'm showing my age, but at school we learnt remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. You know, those sorts of things, remember dates. They are very, very effective. So because what you're doing is when I talk about context, I'm talking about different things that can attach to that information. So that's how context works. Similarly with elaboration, it provides alternative methods of recall. So a really good way, really, really effective way, if you're trying to teach somebody some complex information, is to give them the information and get them to explain it to the person next to them, or go home and explain it to their cat. Anything, as long as you're reframing that information, you're creating a more robust memory of the different components of something. You know, if it's quite complex, that's quite important. So you're creating additional associations. Using concrete examples are good. So if you were trying to, I can't think of anything. If you were, but percentages. If you were trying to, a very simple one is primary school children when you're trying to teach them addition. And you know, when you've got like Rebecca has 3 apples and John has 2 apples, that type of thing. That helps. Those very concrete examples help when teaching people new information. Explaining to others, I've just said that. Combining visuals and words. Now, we talked about this, about remembering whether you lock the front door, but it's very effective if you can create a number of, as I said this before in terms of context as well, create a number of different representations of some information. It gives the student, the learner, more pathways into that information when it needs to be recalled. So just very briefly, how does elaboration not work? So here's a little cartoon I actually found today, which is explain Newton's first law of motion in your own words. And then just makes up a load of nonsense words. I love loopholes. So that's not a brilliant example. I just kind of like the cartoon. But how does elaboration not work? Right, so here is not good elaboration. Say you want to teach children about an historical event. And so what you say is you think, I know what we'll do. We'll get the children to make puppets of the characters. And so, you know, let's say it's Henry VIII. I mean, my history was terrible, you know, like when I went to school in the 70s, it was just like so white and, you know, like imperial history. So I'm hoping it's improved. But say it was King Henry VIII and his wives. So we'll make puppets of King Henry VIII and the wives. That'll be really good. You know, it's elaboration. They're going to be painting things and they're going to be dressing them and there. That is not good elaboration, because they will remember how to make the puppet, but they won't remember what actually happened, what the historical event was. What would be a much better way is to get the children to explain something about the history to somebody else. This is why, and you will all know this, is like getting children to do presentations or mini plays, you know, assemblies and that sort of thing is a really good way of getting them to understand new information, because they really have to think back to the levels of processing. They really have to get involved in the meaning of the information. And that's what elaboration is, to reframing relevant information. Somebody said, I love Calvin and Hobbes. I do too. So if you want to know more about this, that there's no better resource, I think, than this website. I don't know if anybody knows about it, thelearningscientist.org. It's a very, very good resource for educators, for researchers. It's got a number of blogs, so information is explained, in a very accessible way, which is related to what we've been talking about here. Right, so I just wanted to talk about some tips, because we did want you to, if you want to go away and think about how you might apply this in your own learning settings, teaching settings. So long-term memory, use existing knowledge. So if you can make what you're teaching relevant to the children in some way, that will be helpful. Survival scenarios are really, really good. So what do I mean by this? So if you wanted to, let's just use the example I had before of all the list of animals, and then I read the story. So that's kind of good, because you can imagine that you are walking through the house, and so you can remember the shark and the donkey and the cat and the survival scenarios. Now, you don't want to traumatize children, but survival scenarios and a competition is always a really, really good thing. Like this, oh, I've got to win this one. I need to get this many points. If I can remember this many words, I will beat the other team or whatever. I don't know whether competition is encouraged in school these days, so I apologize if it isn't. But we do know that survival scenarios work much more effectively than just a standard scenario like the house with the animals in it. Now, that works well, don't get me wrong, it works really, really well. But if you want to make memory even better, make it some kind of survival. And this, in evolutionary terms, makes sense, doesn't it? If we had to do something in order to survive, we're going to remember that next time because we're going to need it. So like I said, don't traumatize the children, but some kind of survival scenario. Encourage explanation, reframing. So teach to learn. If you want to learn something, there's no better way than teaching it, because you have to know it and you have to be able to explain it. So that's a very good strategy. Use mnemonics and rhymes. The weirder the better. Yeah, so if something is really, really strange in a rhyme or some kind of mnemonic, like the spelling a word from the first letter of the words that you want to remember. Yeah, that makes sense. The weirder the better. It just creates a more distinct memory, because creating memories that are distinct from existing information is also very effective. Low stakes testing. Sorry about my dogs. Low stakes testing. I talked about that. So recall, effortful recall, very, very effective. But don't stress the kids out, because that will have a negative effect. So the working memory, just to recap, don't overload working memory unnecessarily. So keep irrelevant information out of the way. Use short repeated chunks so that they don't have to hold too much information in mind. But if you repeat it, like I said, it makes it easier to recall later, because you're creating that, in long-term memory, you're creating that connection more robust. Yeah, unnecessary background noise. This is more like in classrooms and stuff, and it makes perfect sense. Like me talking to you now with my dogs barking in the background was difficult. If I was trying to learn something, that would be even more difficult. And a lot of students study with music playing. I don't know how they do that. Attention grabbing is distracting. So, in some environments, you can have I know in primary schools, I don't know how well this works. In primary schools, you can have a lot of stuff on the walls. I'm not criticizing that, because I know it has a purpose, it has a role. But I'm sure that any of you are primary school teachers are very aware of the children that just can't resist getting up and touching the new paintings on the wall or something else new in the classroom. But this is more about being, what you want children to do is to be able to focus their attention. So the less information that is grabbing their attention away, the better. And don't force unnecessary task switching. So I'm sorry, I'm realizing it's 3 minutes to 5. So this is about chopping and changing what children are doing. If that's necessary for the learning process, that's a good thing. But as I explained last week, this switching between set rules really overloads working memory. So if it's not necessary, it's best to be avoided. But this is all stuff that you can go away and think about. And I'm really, really sorry that I've only left 3 minutes for questions, but I'm happy to hang on for like 5 minutes afterwards or whatever. So that's me. So the next session in 2 weeks' time, we'll discuss any practices that you may have been able to put in place over those few weeks, and you can ask me questions about them. Right. So I think do I hand back to Beverly or Susan now?
Yep.